Have you ever had the feeling that something is deeply wrong with modern life, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is? As if, despite all the technological achievements, the endless possibilities of choice, and the promise of freedom, there is a constant emptiness, a silent restlessness that never goes away. You wake up, grab your phone, see a flood of notifications, scroll through dozens of posts, stories, messages, but deep down, you feel that none of this really fills what is missing. The world has never been so connected, and yet we have never felt so alone. The problem is not you. This feeling is not a coincidence. It is not a personal failure. It is a symptom of something much larger, something that silently shapes our lives without us realizing it. The liquid society. Sociologist Zygmunt Bauman described this era as a time of uncertainties, fragile ties, disposable relationships, where everything changes too quickly and nothing seems solid. Unlike the past, when people had fixed structures to rely on, stable communities, lifelong careers, values that provided a sense of continuity, today, everything seems to slip through our fingers. Everything is temporary. Everything can be replaced. And this liquidity affects not only our relationships or our jobs, but also the way we see ourselves. Have you noticed how nowadays it seems like we are always trying to sell ourselves? On Instagram, on LinkedIn, even in everyday conversations, all the time we have to prove our worth, show that we are interesting, that we are doing well, that we have a life worth observing. But the moment we stop, when the screens go dark and silence takes over, that uncomfortable feeling hits. Who are we when no one is watching? The truth is that modern society doesn't want you to stop and think about this. It needs you to be constantly distracted, consuming, producing, scrolling down the screen without ever questioning what really matters. But what if you stopped? What if, for a moment, you allowed yourself to see the truth behind this emptiness? Liquid society has taught us that nothing is permanent. But does that mean we are doomed to a life of superficiality and anxiety? In this video, we will dive into Zygmunt Bauman's ideas and understand why modernity has made us feel so empty. And more importantly, we will explore what we can do to escape this suffocating feeling that we are always chasing something that never arrives. Because perhaps the solution is not to run faster, but to stop and see where we are going. To understand why modern life makes us feel so empty, we first need to grasp the concept of liquid modernity, described by Zygmunt Bauman. Imagine a world where everything that was once solid, stable, and reliable now dissolves like water slipping through your fingers. In the past, life was built on fixed foundations: a job for life, a structured family, immutable values passed down from generation to generation. Choices were more limited, but there was a sense of security, a sense of continuity. Today, that stability simply no longer exists. We live in a time where everything changes all the time. Relationships begin and end with a click. Careers become obsolete overnight. Trends emerge and disappear before they can even be understood. And the most frightening part? We have become hostages to this instability. Modern society tells us that uncertainty is freedom, that flexibility is a gift, that the ability to constantly change jobs, cities, partners, and opinions is proof of progress. But this supposed freedom comes with a brutal psychological cost: anxiety, insecurity, and a constant feeling of being adrift. Bauman compared modernity to a liquid precisely because nothing retains a defined shape anymore. Think about relationships, for example. In the past, a marriage was a solid structure built to last. There were problems, of course, but people dealt with them within the perspective of something enduring. Today, relationships are seen as temporary contracts, where any sign of difficulty can be enough for one party to simply walk away. Commitment has become synonymous with imprisonment and detachment of virtue. This creates a dynamic where no one wants to truly deepen their connection with another, knowing that everything could change tomorrow. The same happens with our identities. Before, they were shaped by culture, community, and tradition. Today, we are bombarded with the idea that we need to reinvent ourselves all the time. Who you are is never enough. You need to be more productive, more interesting, more desirable. You need to change, improve, grow, not out of a genuine desire for evolution, but because liquid society demands that you never stop. If you are not transforming, you are falling behind. And the result of this? An increasingly anxious, lost humanity without a real sense of belonging. If everything is ephemeral, how can we create something meaningful? If everything is fluid, how can we build a life that has purpose? Bauman shows us that liquid modernity not only dissolves the structures around us, but also dissolves our own identity. And if you feel like you are always running without getting anywhere, perhaps it is because you have been trained never to find a destination. If before our identity was built on solid values, family, community, profession, ideals, today it is defined by what we consume. Our appearance, our gadgets, our hobbies, and even our opinions have become products, carefully packaged to be displayed and validated by others. You are not just a person, you are a personal brand. And if you don't sell a compelling enough image, you risk becoming irrelevant. We live in a time where the question, "Who am I?" has been replaced by, "How do I appear to others?" Social media has transformed identity into a public spectacle, where every photo, every phrase, and every interaction are carefully calculated to project an idealized version of ourselves. If you feel good, but don't post about it, did it really happen? If you have a significant moment but don't get likes, did it have value? These are the modern dilemmas imposed on us by liquid society. Bauman identified this phenomenon as the triumph of consumerism over belonging. In the past, our identity was rooted in communities and values that transcended immediate desire. Today, we are encouraged to constantly reinvent ourselves through consumption. We buy clothes, not just to dress, but to communicate a status. We choose phones, not just for performance, but for what they say about us. Even experiences, trips, restaurants, events have become products we consume to project a desirable image. But here's the problem. This identity based on consumption is extremely fragile. Just as a new phone quickly becomes outdated, our self-image also needs to be constantly updated. You cannot stop. You cannot simply be. You must always be transforming into something new, more interesting, more desirable. And this creates a dangerous psychological trap, the constant fear of not being enough. The emptiness of liquid society does not come from a lack of options, but from an excess of them. How do you choose something when the market always offers a better version right after? How do you commit to an identity when the promise of something new is always there, flashing before our eyes? Liquid modernity has conditioned us to never be satisfied, because a satisfied consumer is a consumer who stops buying. And if your identity is tied to what you consume, then the last thing the system wants is for you to feel complete. But what happens when we take this logic into relationships? If everything is disposable and replaceable, how does that affect the way we connect with others? That is the next point we will explore. If everything in modern society is fluid, disposable, and constantly replaced, it makes sense that this has also affected the way we relate to others. In the past, Relationships were seen as something to be built with patience, with the willingness to face difficulties and grow alongside one another. There was a sense of permanence, an idea that certain connections were worth the effort to maintain. But in the era of liquid modernity, that mindset has disappeared. Today, the rule is simple. If something becomes difficult, replace it. Bauman described this phenomenon as the fear of permanence, a direct reflection of consumer society. Just as we are trained to always seek the next novelty, the next upgrade, the next experience, we are also conditioned to avoid any bond that might require real commitment. Love, friendship, even family connections have become superficial and fragile. We are always with one foot in and one foot out, constantly evaluating whether there is something better just around the corner, in the next opportunity, the next match, the next ephemeral connection that makes us feel alive for a moment before disappearing. This explains why so many relationships today are marked by a constant sense of instability. Nothing seems secure. A small disagreement is already reason enough to give up. The fear of deepening the connection with another is real, because in liquid logic, the deeper you dive, the more vulnerable you become. If everything can be replaced, why invest time and energy in something that may not last? It's better to keep everything on the surface light, without deep emotional risks. The problem is that shallow connections never truly fulfill. They distract, momentarily relieve loneliness, but never resolve the emptiness. This is also reflected in how we deal with the idea of belonging. Lasting communities have given way to temporary networks. Groups formed out of convenience and dissolved at the slightest sign of conflict. We are surrounded by people, but we rarely feel that we belong anywhere. Belonging requires continuity. It requires roots, and liquid society has trained us to be emotional nomads, always ready to leave. But this fear of commitment does not only affect relationships, it creates a domino effect that spreads throughout our lives, making even our most trivial decisions sources of anxiety. Career, personal projects, life choices, everything feels unstable, as if any choice is a burden rather than a foundation. And this leads us to the next point: the chronic anxiety that has become the hallmark of modernity. Liquid modernity has not only taught us to avoid commitments and treat everything as disposable, it has condemned us to a constant state of anxiety and loneliness. When nothing is permanent and everything can be replaced, we live under a silent and unrelenting pressure to always be adapting, reinventing ourselves, proving our worth. This exhausting effort generates a sense of restlessness that never disappears. Think about how obsessed we are with external validation. Social media has trained us to measure our worth in likes, comments, and shares. Our self-image is no longer built internally, but shaped by the reactions of others. If a photo receives few likes, if a story is ignored, if a message is not answered quickly, we feel an almost irrational unease. But why does this happen? Because in liquid society, being ignored means being irrelevant. And being irrelevant is the worst possible fate in a world where everything and everyone can be replaced. This logic also applies to how we deal with the future. In the past, life was predictable. You were born, grew up, followed a relatively structured path: school, work, marriage, family, retirement. Today, there is no longer a clear script. The world tells us we can be anything, follow any path. But this apparent freedom turns into paralysis. If all options are available, how do you choose? If at any moment something better might come up, how do you commit to any decision? This excess of possibilities, instead of liberating us, traps us in an endless cycle of doubt and procrastination. And then comes loneliness. Liquid society has sold us the idea that we're more connected than ever, but in practice, we have never been so lonely. We spend hours interacting digitally, but when the phone is turned off, what remains? Often, a deafening silence. Superficial ties do not fulfill the human need for deep connection. We may have hundreds of contacts, but few true friends. We may have casual encounters, but few meaningful relationships. And this leaves us with the painful feeling that, despite being surrounded by people, we are essentially alone. And what is society's response to this anguish? More consumption, more distraction, more stimuli that prevent us from stopping and facing this emptiness head-on. But is there a way out of this cycle? How can we resist the liquid logic and find something solid amid the chaos? This is what we will explore in the next part. If liquid society teaches us to avoid commitments, to base our identity on consumption, and to live in a constant state of anxiety and loneliness, the big question is, how do we escape this cycle? How do we find genuine meaning in a world that encourages us to never stop, to never delve deeper, to never put down roots? The answer is not simple, because resisting liquid modernity means going against the tide. It means giving up comfortable superficiality and facing the difficulty of building something solid when everything around us tells us to stay on the surface. The first step is to recognize the problem. Much of our dissatisfaction comes from the fact that we do not consciously see the structure in which we're trapped. We think that anxiety, loneliness, and the feeling of emptiness are individual failures, when in fact, they are symptoms of a system designed to keep us that way. Once we understand that this dissatisfaction is not just in our heads, but a product of the society we live in, we can begin to seek alternatives. One of those alternatives is to relearn the value of permanence. In a world where everything is disposable, the simple act of committing to something, be it a relationship, a project, or a community, becomes an act of resistance. Stability is not a burden. It is the foundation upon which we can build something meaningful. Instead of fleeing at the first sign of difficulty, we need to relearn how to face challenges with the awareness that nothing truly valuable is built overnight. Another way to escape this liquid logic is to disconnect from the culture of consumption as identity. This does not mean stopping consumption, but rather stopping defining who we are based on what we own. It means seeking a meaning that goes beyond external validation, fleeting trends, and the incessant need to reinvent ourselves to remain relevant. It means cultivating an internal purpose, something that does not depend on market fluctuations, social media, or the approval of others. And perhaps the hardest change, but also the most necessary, is to relearn how to be alone without feeling lonely. Liquid society has trained us to seek constant distraction, to never be silent, to always fill our time with stimuli. But depth, self-knowledge, and true connection with others only emerge when we learn to endure stillness, introspection, and the discomfort of being just with ourselves. In the end, resisting liquid modernity does not mean completely rejecting the world we live in. It means finding ways to navigate through it without losing ourselves. It means building islands of solidity in an ocean of uncertainties. And now that we understand the problem and have discussed possible solutions, one last question remains. How do we turn this knowledge into action? How do we take the first concrete steps to escape the emptiness of liquid society and build a life with more meaning? This is what we will discuss in the conclusion. If you've made it this far, you've already realized that the emptiness of modern life is not an individual problem. It's not your fault. It's not because you're not trying hard enough, not consuming the right things. or not keeping up with the frantic pace of the world. This emptiness is a symptom of something much larger, a system designed to keep us restless, dissatisfied, and always searching for something that never arrives. Liquid modernity dissolves everything: our relationships, our certainties, our very identity. It teaches us that nothing should last, that everything can be replaced, that always being in motion is synonymous with freedom. But has this freedom not become a new form of imprisonment? The great paradox of liquid society is that by freeing us from the old rigid structures, it has left us adrift. It promised us that we could be anything, but it gave us so much instability that now we no longer know who we are. It told us we could have any relationship, but left us afraid to commit. It offered us an infinite ocean of possibilities, but took the ground from beneath our feet. And that's why so many people feel this silent restlessness, this sense that something is missing, because it truly is. The question is, what to do with this knowledge? Now that you understand how liquid modernity shapes your life, you have two choices. You can continue going with the flow, adapting to every new trend, trying to fill the void with distractions, consuming experiences like products that soon lose their shine. Or you can start to build something solid, something that has depth, something that goes beyond the disposable logic of the modern world. This could mean truly committing to something, whether it's a relationship, a project, a life philosophy. It could mean disconnecting from the need for external validation and starting to live according to your own values. It could simply mean learning to stop, to be present, to endure silence without needing to fill it with constant stimuli. Because what liquid society fears more than anything is that you become aware of what is happening, that you realize you don't have to live in this endless cycle of dissatisfaction, that you can go beneath the surface and dive into something real. Now I want to know, do you feel this emptiness? Have you noticed how liquid modernity affects your life? Comment below and share your perspective. And if this video resonated with you, don't stop here. The next video is essential to delve even deeper into this discussion. If you really want to understand how to escape this cycle, keep watching. I'll see you there.